All right, Joseph. Good evening. Let us begin. We are beginning on Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. Yeah, new Daf tonight. Baruch Hashem, 11a. 11a. So the Gemara says as follows. Bishlama Beis Hillel Kamafarshi Tamayu. So remember again, just to orient ourselves a little bit. So we had a really incredible Mishnah. Chaim, you brought enough for everyone? Yeah. Okay, I just wanna yeah. So as I remember again, in the Mishnah we saw an interesting machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Namely, again, how do you interpret b'shach b'cha uvekumecha? So remember again, Beis Shammai understands it as an actual physical position, a physical posture. B'shach b'cha, the nighttime shema, ultimately you lie down. The daytime shema, you actually sit up. So that's Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel understands b'shach b'cha v'kumecha, ultimately again is talking about time of day. Time of day that you say morning Shema. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rabbi Shmuel Silber. Thank you so much. You can make a bracha. That's a bit extreme. It's even a bit extreme for you. So now. So the Gemara says as follows. So that was Machlokes Beis Shammai. So says the Gemara. So Bishlama Beis Hillel Kamafarshi Tamayu v'Taima de Beis Shammai. So remember again, Beis Hillel explains their reasoning as well as the reasoning of Beis Shammai. Ela Beis Shammai my taima lo amri ke Beis Hillel. But ultimately, again, why doesn't Beis Shammai hold like Beis Hillel? Right? In other words, a simple, straightforward idea, right? So again, I understand that why Beis Hillel holds their position and doesn't hold like Beis Shammai. I don't understand why Beis Shammai doesn't hold like Beis Hillel. Amri lecha Beis Shammai, because Beis Shammai will say im kain neimakra. Beis Shammai will say like this: Beis Hillel, if you're correct that b'shach b'cha uvekumecha is not talking about postures, rather it's talking about timing. Im kain neimakra baboker uba'erev. Let the pasuk 11a, 4 lines up from the top. Let the pasuk just say in the morning, right, and in the evening. Baboker ba'erev. Why my b'shach b'cha uvekumecha? Ultimately, again, why does it say b'shach b'cha uvekumecha? In other words, we'll see. Hear this. Beis Shammai says, if the pasuk is going to teach me the time of day in which I recite Shema, so just don't use ambiguous lashon. Just say, when do you say Shema? Baboker in the morning, uba'erev, and at night. What is b'shach b'cha uvekumecha? What is that? So the Gemara says, "My b'shach b'cha uvekumecha b'shas shchiva mamish, or b'shas kima mamish." So Beis Shammai says that Allah what it teaches means b'shach b'cha literally means at the time when you go to sleep, i.e. nighttime Shema, you have to literally be lying down, and at the time of the morning Shema, you have to literally be standing up. He's standing up. Beis Shammai, hay uvelechtecha b'derech my avadu. So both say so now again. So therefore, we pause here for just a second. So now we understand the machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel b'shach b'cha uvekumecha. Again, Beis Hillel b'shach b'cha uvekumecha tells you recite the Shema, nighttime Shema when people go to sleep, i.e. after nightfall, and you recite the daytime Shema at the time that people begin to get up. That's Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai, b'shach b'cha, nighttime Shema you recite lying down. B'kumecha, daytime Shema, you recite sitting up, standing up. Fine. So it says the Gemara. Listen to this. Beis Shammai, hay uvelechtecha b'derech my avadu. So both say, what does Beis Shammai do with the phrase uvelechtecha b'derech? Right? Because remember, the pasuk says that again, when are you supposed to engage in Shema? B'lechtecha b'derech, when you're walking on your way. So what does that mean? This is actually interesting. Ultimately, again, we require it ultimately for the following teaching. B'shiftecha, listen to this. Pasuk says that ultimately, again, when should you say Shema? B'shiftecha b'veisecha, when you're sitting in your house. So b'shiftecha b'veisecha prat la'osik b'mitzvah. So we'll say, when do you say Shema? When you're sitting in your house. Now, what does sitting in your house represent? Sitting in your house represents you're sitting and not engaged in anything else. What does it come to exclude? It comes to exclude a case where I am engaged in a mitzvah. We have a constant in halacha of osik b'mitzvah, patam in mitzvah. If you are actively engaged in the performance of one mitzvah, then by definition you're exempt from the performance of another mitzvah. I'll give you just like an extreme example of this. Extreme example of this. So let's say, for example, a person is participating in a funeral. right? Which obviously, again, is an incredible act of chesed, a mitzvah of taking care of the dead. And there's 10 minutes left to the time for Kriyas Shema of the morning. So either I could stop participating in the burial, and say Shema, or continue with the burial and miss Shema. So what's the halacha? So this is all assuming, of course, that I'm needed for the burial. Then halacha l'maisa, we say, no, continue doing what you're doing. Why? Since you're engaged in the performance of one mitzvah, by definition, you are exempt from a different mitzvah. So that's an extreme case. So I was thinking about this, our chaver Elia, who usually sits right at the second table, his father was just niftar. Levi is tomorrow morning, Emir Hashem, at 11 o'clock a.m. I'll share the information with the shiur. So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, fine. That's b'shiftcha b'veisecha, prat l'osik b'mitzvah, u'v'lechtecha b'derech. And what does it mean when you walk on your way? Prat l'chasen. Interesting. Who else is exempt? So it's interesting. In other words, these phrases come to tell you when you're obligated and when you're exempted from Shema. So b'shiftecha b'veisecha, you're obligated to say Shema when you sit in your house. What does sitting in your house mean? You're not actively engaged in the performance of another mitzvah. But if you are actively engaged in the performance of another mitzvah, ultimately you're pater from Shema. Fine. V'lechtecha b'derech, you're also chayv in Shema when you walk on the road. Now, interestingly enough, what does that come to exclude? A chasen. I'll say that a chassan, again, we'll define this a bit more, but a chassan specifically on his wedding night is exempt from the obligation of Shema. We'll discuss why that is in just a little bit. Mikana Amru, listen to this. From here we learned. So we'll say, the common denominator here of this drasha is the obligation of Shema essentially only devolves upon you when you are not otherwise occupied in the performance of another mitzvah. But if you are otherwise occupied in the performance of a mitzvah, you're exempt from Shema. So the Gemara says, Mikana, from here they said, Hakonis es habasula pater, ve'es ha'almana chayiv. Ultimately, if one marries a basula, then one is pater. One is exempt, ultimately, again, from Shema, but an almana. Almana is a widow. Now, it doesn't have to be a widow. What is really making a distinction before is a first marriage versus a second marriage. When a person gets married for the first time, assuming again it's the first time for the both of them, then ultimately again the chassan is pater from Shema. We'll discuss why that is. If it's a second marriage, then ultimately again there's no exemption from Shema. Now, by the way, if you take a look at Rashi says over here, hakonis es habasula pater shetarud b'machshavas be'ilas mitzvah. So it's actually interesting that for a first time marriage, the Chazal understood that the man is preoccupied with the wedding night, preoccupied with the first act of relations. So because of that, again, his mindset is not for Shema. So now, by the way, also kind of to take this a step further, remember, the first act of relations when a couple gets married is a mitzvah. So it also falls under the umbrella of being engaged in one mitzvah exempts you from a different mitzvah. Now, what's interesting about this is as follows. Generally, we'll say, right? Generally, in order to avail yourself of the exemption of you're engaged in one mitzvah, you're exempt from something else. What do you need? Right? At the same time, an active engagement. In other words, we'll say, like, it doesn't work. It's time to go to Shachris. It's time to go to Shachris, right? And I think to myself, you know what? I am really thinking about the mitzvah of sending away the mother bird, right? That's like, I'm really preoccupied with that, right? So I'm thinking about it. So really, I learned the halacha. You're involved in one mitzvah, you don't have to do another mitzvah. So obviously that's not how it works. It requires active engagement. What's interesting about this is as follows. Obviously, we're not talking about that the chassan is pater from Shema during the actual act of relations. He's not saying Shema. What he's saying is there's a mental preoccupation. Right? In other words, on the wedding night, he knows what it is that Emir Hashem is going to occur, and it weighs on his mind. So what's interesting is in this case, it's actually a mental preoccupation with a mitzvah, which exempts him ultimately from the mitzvah. But that mental preoccupation only applies when the woman is a basula, if she's a virgin. Because then the first act of relations, again, is a bit more complicated. But ultimately, if it's a second marriage, where again the act of relations will be just physiologically easier, there's not that same level of preoccupation. So interesting. So I just want to point out that even though this is osik b'mitzvah, patam and mitzvah, it's a different kind. It's interesting. We'll see more about this. My mashma. So, brother, where do you get that from? U'v'lechtecha b'derech, right? Like, in other words, how did that happen? Right? We just went from the pasuk says u'v'lechtecha b'derech, right? When you're walking on the road, that's how you say Shema. But a chassan on his wedding night doesn't have to say Shema. Okay, the Gemara is listening to this. Amar Papa ki derech, mad derech rishus, af kol rishus. So this is interesting. The Gemara says, what is belechtecha b'derech? So it's kind of like b'shiftecha b'veisecha or belechtecha b'derech are the same concepts. B'shiftecha b'veisecha means you're sitting in your house and what? And what? Not otherwise engaged. Belechtecha b'derech, even if you are engaged, but if you're engaged in your own stuff, then you have to say Shema. But again, if you're engaged in some mitzvah matter, ultimately you're exempt from Shema. So the Gemara says, "Ma derech rishus," just like derech refers to something optional. Af kol rishus, so too, as long as you're engaged in any, so to speak, what's not optional. What's the word? I'll call it like discretionary behavior. In other words, you're engaged in you don't have to be engaged in. So halacha l'maisa, you have to say Shema. But if you're engaged in some type of maisa, some type of action which is mandated, and again it preoccupies you, you're exempt from Shema. So the Gemara says, "Milo askin deka azlo dvar mitzvah, ba'afilo hachi amar achmana likri." So I don't know. Maybe uvelechta chabaderech even means a case where a person is traveling to do a mitzvah. And even though he's traveling to do a mitzvah, even then, the Torah says to him, what? You have to say Shema. You have to say Shema. If that's the case, the Gemara says, Im kain lichtov rachmana b'sheves ubeleches. Interesting. The Torah could have said, when you sit and when you walk. My b'shiftecha ubelechtecha. But say, if you notice, it's written in what? The possessive. When you, it's almost as if the better way to translate it is, when you are sitting your own sitting in your home, and when you are walking your own walking on the path, which means what? I am engaged in personal discretionary activity, right? That lamaisa, again, I don't have an obligation to go ahead and do what it is that I'm doing. There's no mandate. I'm just simply going ahead and, doing my own activities. In that case, then there's an obligation for Shema. Incredible. So the Gemara says, when you're sitting for your own reasons, or you're traveling for your own reasons, that's ultimately, again, the mechayeves. That's when you're obligated in Shema. Had the mitzvah patiras. But if you're engaged in the mitzvah, ultimately you'll be exempt. Incredible. But I don't understand. If it's about mental preoccupation, then what does it matter if it's a first marriage or a second marriage, right? A man gets married to a woman. Again, by definition, there's going to be a certain amount of preoccupation on that night, on the wedding night. What does it matter if she's a basula or she's an almana? So the Gemara says, so the Gemara says, "Hai tarid v'hai lo tarid." Here's the difference with a basula, where it's the first act of relations for her. Understandably, there's more weighing on his mind. As opposed to ultimately an almana, where again, it's not the first act of relations for her. It may or may not be the first act of relations for him. There's not the same mental preoccupation. There's not the same tirda. Someone says, whoa, 1 second. So now you're telling me that being preoccupied with something is a reason to go ahead and be exempt from Shema? If that's the case, imishum tirda, afilu tava svinasa bayam nami. But 1 second, if that's the case, if it's about tirda, what about the following case? We'll say, what happens? I own a fleet of ships. Mirz Hashem Bayu, right? I own a fleet of ships. Right? And now what happens? One of my boats sank. Now obviously if the boat sinks, that means what? I've suffered a monetary loss. Chavra, how are you going to be feeling after suffering the sinkage? I don't know if that's a word, right? Right? The Houthis took over your boat in the Red Sea, right? And then, right, how are you going to be feeling? Not very good. I'm preoccupied. So now 1 second. Are you telling me that preoccupation is an exemption, is grounds for exemption? Now understand, by the way, what a Pandora's box that opens. Can you imagine if this was true? Right? If being preoccupied would exempt you from Shema? No, right? Who's ever gonna? Right? I checked my stocks right before my forget it. I did this, I did that. I had a bad day at work, whatever. In other words, so the Gemara says, but again, what you're telling me ultimately is the chassan, when he's marrying a woman for a besula, he's exempt from Kriyat Shema the night of his wedding because he's preoccupied. So if it's a din in preoccupation, so then even if a person suffers a monetary loss and as a result is preoccupied with the reality of that loss, then maybe halacha l'maisa should be exempt as well. To which the Gemara says, no. Maybe we'll say that's true. Alama Amrabi Abba Bar Zavda Amarav Avel Chayiv B'Chala Mitzvos Ha'amuras Torah. Both is interesting. An Avel, a mourner. Now we're talking about, let's say, during Shiva, during Shiva, a mourner is obligated in all mitzvos, with the exception of chutz minat tefillin, with the exception of tefillin. Now the truth is, the way we paskin is, an avel doesn't put on tefillin the first day. The first day of Shiva, the avel doesn't usually put on tefillin. Shari nemar bahem fe'er, because the pasuk calls tefillin a fe'er. Fe'er means literally like a crown or glory. Shneimar fe'ercha chavush alecha. So we'll say, so here's what's interesting, right? So now, if you think about it, an avel is preoccupied, right? A mourner is preoccupied. He's preoccupied with his loss. So I would have thought that if it's all about, in other words, if preoccupation is really grounds for mitzvah exemption, that an avel should not be chayiv in mitzvos. But yet we know that an avel is chayiv in mitzvos. An avel is chayiv in mitzvos. So how do you reconcile this? Hasam, here we go. Hasam tarid tirda de mitzvah. Hacha tarid tirda de rishos. So now we'll say, this is kind of intuitive. We knew that this was coming, but the Gemara essentially explains that there's a distinction between preoccupation that is rooted in mitzvah performance versus preoccupation that is rooted in mundane realities. So my boat sinks, again, mundane. So here's what's interesting. Even an avel, it's interesting that avelos is a behavioral obligation. There are certain behavioral obligations I'm obligated, but there is no obligation to be sad during Shiva. Isn't that interesting? Right? There's no obligation to, in other words, there's an obligation to behaviorally mourn, but there is no obligation to be like in an emotional state of sadness. So therefore, again, but I am sad. I lost someone who I love. You're allowed to be sad, but just understand that's not mitzvah sadness. What is that? Emotion. That's personal sadness. A person just being emotional, understandably so. So the Gemara makes a suggestion that preoccupation could exempt you from a mitzvah when it's preoccupation with another mitzvah. But stam preoccupation, even though you're going to be distracted, that is not grounds for the performance of a mitzvah. Matt, you were going to say something?
That's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
That would be the distinction between onen and someone during Shiva.
Onen is a whole separate thing. So I was making reference to over here is the idea that we know that between death and burial, there's a state of aninus. At that point, the mourner is exempt from everything. Yeah, that's a total. I shouldn't say totally. That's the basis for that exemption is osik b'mitzvah patra min mitzvah. You're engaged in taking care of the needs of the dead, therefore you're exempt. That's not. So there, it's even stronger. It's not tirda. There, I'm like actively engaged. That's why, when you have these type of situations where, let's say, there is, sometimes you have just like these just circumstantial situations where there's a long delay between death and burial. You wouldn't necessarily be in aninos that entire time, because aninos is a din. Ultimately, again, we had this happened not so infrequently during COVID. So I remember there was someone from the shul who lost their parent. The burial was in Canada. I think Canada's still in lockdown, aren't they? I think they must still be in lockdown now, right? So somebody should tell them that it's over, right? So Lamaisa, I remember again. This is actually wild. They were looking at the potential of up to a week and a half, to transfer the body, right, from the States to Canada. There was like a whole bunch of like. So Baruch Hashem, it turned out that case. It was fine. It worked out all right. But Lamaisa, in that kind of case, you wouldn't be exempt the entire time, only when you're actively involved. All right, so let's go a little bit weiter. Just another minute. So Gemara says as follows. Beis Shammai will say, "Hahomi baile prat l'shluchei mitzvah." So Beis Shammai needs this part to teach me that who is exempt from Shema, shluchei mitzvah. Now we'll say shluchei mitzvah are people on a mitzvah mission. Right? Someone is on a mission to perform a mitzvah, whatever it is. I'm going to go ahead, and we'll say it's it's an amazing thing. Hopefully tomorrow we're going to see again some of our precious hostages reunited with their families. So let's say again there's a mitzvah. There's a mitzvah peyon shvuyim of redeeming captives. Let's say I'm involved in that. I'm going to help redeem captives. That's a shliach mitzvah. I'm exempt from the mitzvah. I'm exempt from another mitzvah. Beis Hillel amri memela shmamina. So Beis Hillel will say that's obvious. Of course, shluchei mitzvah, people on a mitzvah mission, of course, are exempt. Why? Because Beis Hillel will say dafilu baderech nami kari. Now remember again, Beis Hillel says ubelechtecha baderech. Belech Techa B'derech teaches you what? That halacha l'maisa, only when you are walking on your way, right? Your way, your path, doing your thing, are you obligated in Shema? But if somehow, again, you are obligated you are performing a mitzvah, then halacha l'maisa, you would not have to go ahead and say Shema. So we'll say, let's pause. We're going to stop over here for tonight, but just a quick chazara, because we actually did a lot, right? So ultimately, again, we have our machlokas Yesham Beis Hillel, how to understand b'shach b'chav kumecha, right? Beis Shammai is saying, again, it's actually about physical posture. Beis Hillel is saying, ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, it is about timing. Now, what comes out, and this is the point that everyone agrees, is that the phrases of b'shiftecha b'veisecha, when you sit in your house, b'lechtecha b'derech, teach us that it is only when you are unoccupied with mitzvah matters that you're obligated in Shema. But if you are otherwise occupied in the performance of a mitzvah, you are absolutely exempted from Shema. One more nuance to that the unique case of a chassan, of a man and woman who get married, and the man's marrying a basula, in that case, the tirda de mitzvah, the preoccupation with the mitzvah itself, even though, again, not the actual engagement, but the preoccupation would be enough to exempt it from the mitzvah as well. I will say, shkoyach. Let's say thank you. I have to just also give all of you a thank you. Like, I love learning Berachos with all of you. Like it's on a regular night, it's like the perfect bookend to a day. I know, whatever happened during the day, Mirz Hashem, we get to close out at least the time in the base center. So I'll say thank you for coming. I know it's Thanksgiving, everybody's all over the place. Thank you for accommodating the time changes, and thank you also for participating in the polls. I worked very hard. I worked very hard on those WhatsApp polls, and yeah, you can. Although I have to look, because some people who don't come to the shiur were voting, so I had to have a minute to call them out. But I decided not something down wrong.